is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello, welcome to Global Business Europe, live from CGTN in London. I'm Jamie Owen.
And I'm Juliet Mann. Our top stories. Tech stocks tumble as China's internet watchdog widens its crackdown on big digital companies.
Our other headlines: shopping for a supermarket, the multi-billion-dollar battle for Morrison's, the British retail chain, in the middle of a bidding war.
UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson confirms the loosening of England's remaining COVID restrictions.
Miami's partially collapsed apartment block is demolished because of safety concerns ahead of an impending storm.
And bye-bye Bezos. Amazon's CEO checks out 27 years after founding the e-commerce giant.
China has widened its probe into US-listed digital giants over cybersecurity concerns.
The move comes a day after China removed ride-hailing app Didi from its domestic app stores, also over concerns around private data security violations.
Well, shares in Chinese tech companies have fallen as a result. Let's talk now to our correspondent John Terrett in New York. John, the market closed today, but has there been any reaction?
Hey, Juliet and Jamie. Yeah, it's the big public holiday associated with the 4th of July today here. So obviously the 4th was on Sunday, so people are having barbecues and things today, and the lovely sunshine that you see behind me in New York. So no market action. But, you know, my opinion on this is that I think there was a certain amount of bewilderment on Friday when this story first came out. People were saying, well, like, they couldn't have mentioned this before. We actually invested in the shares of Didi on Wednesday. But having said that, people who invest in overseas companies know the risks, particularly with China, which, of course, is so far away. It's 12 hours away, a very long way by aeroplane and all that kind of stuff. Two completely different cultures. And investors do know that these companies are subject to local regulation at any time. And that's what's happened here in China. I think there's a little bit of a surprise that it happened quite so quickly after the IPO in the home market, as the Cyberspace Administration of China looks at the issue of cybersecurity in Didi, and now within the last 24 hours the news that the app is going to be withdrawn domestically, so there will be no new users for Didi signing up for the foreseeable future. The allegation is that the company illegally collected data on its users. Didi, interestingly, has said within the past 24 hours that it was unaware that the probe was going to happen before the IPO last Wednesday. And it also, very interestingly, Jamie and Juliet, says that it doesn't think the revenue stream for the company will be affected too badly. Now, here's why. Didi is a huge global company. The people who run it say, look, we were born in China, but we want our company to be a global behemoth. And it kind of already is. They already operate in Latin America and Russia and Australia and Japan, as well as the home market in China. So it is very possible that even though the app has been switched off domestically and there will be no people signing up as new users for the foreseeable future, that the revenue stream won't be affected too badly. That, of course, remains to be seen. And the other thing is we have no idea how long this probe is going to last. But just to reiterate, investors here know that this kind of thing could happen in any of the markets in which they operate anywhere around the world at any time. And I said to you last week when they came to market on Wednesday, one of the biggest ticks in the box against Didi was that regulation could be imposed anywhere at the drop of a hat. Jamie and Juliet?
And John, it isn't just Didi under scrutiny, is it? Can you tell us more about these other two companies also under review?
Well, that's right, and they both trade here as well. So all three of them trade here in New York now. One is called Boss Xipin, which is basically a recruitment app, an online recruitment app. And the other one I think is very interesting indeed. It's called the Full Truck Alliance. Okay, and you can think of that company as really being a Didi or an Uber for trucks. So I suppose if you suddenly just, oh, I need a truck, you get on the app and a truck comes of varying sizes. Anyway, as I say, they both arrived here in New York on the market within the last month, actually, and they're both agreeing, along with Didi, to cooperate over these allegations. But I will say a couple of things to finish off. One is that I think there is a consensus building, certainly in China, and I think it will build here as well now, that maybe if these Chinese tech companies are doing something wrong regarding data collection, then maybe they should think again about their policies and do something about it to get out of this situation quickly. I think it's also worth making the point to our viewers around the world that China is not the only country doing this. You know, there are investigations into these tech companies here in the United States by the European Union, of course, and the government here as well. And, of course, it does come at a time of great anti-China sentiment in the United States. We've got companies that have been delisted at the stock exchange. Americans are banned from investing in certain companies. And, of course, we have the Strategic Competition Act, which is designed to hobble China's overseas ambitions, working its way through the Congress at the moment. Jamie and Juliet?
John Terrace in New York, thank you very much.
Everyone's shopping for a supermarket, and the British retail chain Morrisons is in the middle of a bidding war. Shares have surged just days after the UK's fourth largest supermarket agreed a takeover deal. Now, compared to most sectors, supermarkets have fared pretty well during the pandemic, and Morrisons' performance is now attracting the interest of investment. Last month, the company turned down an offer worth $7.5 billion. That was from private equity firm Clayton, Dubilier & Rice. They argued that the bid significantly undervalued the business. And on Saturday, an $8.7 billion offer by US firm Fortress Investment Group, which owns Majestic Wine, was accepted. Now, the takeover bid is subject to shareholder approval, but the supermarket group's directors are recommending it be accepted. But the battle in the supermarket sweepstake is yet to be won, with another US investment firm now considering a rival offer. Apollo Global says it's evaluating its position, but no approach has yet been made. That prospect alone has further whet the appetite of investors, with shares in Morrisons surging by 11% to 269 pence at the open, which is well past the 254 pence per share offered by Fortress over the weekend. So, with nearly 500 stores and more than 110,000 staff, why so much interest in this chain now? Well, Teresa Wickham is a retail analyst and former director of supermarket chain Safeway. Thanks for joining us. Now, is this about groceries or is it about real estate?
It's more about real estate. And the fact is that we've already seen Walmart, which owned Asda, has fallen to a bidder, although Walmart still has a share in it. And this is the thing, they're looking at Morrisons. The value in Morrisons is that it owns so many of its stores. So that's the property portfolio. It's got petrol forecourts. I mean, some years ago, it was a small regional chain. Then it took over Safeway UK. And that put it back a little bit because it was buying a different company. It thought it was just buying a few more stores. But it catapulted it into the national market. Then it had two chief executives who were more brand than retailers. And now it's got two very strong chairman and chief executive who've been running it for the last few years. And it's got its back to its retail basics. It was a bit slow onto the online things, but it's done deals now with Ocado and Amazon. And as you say, the retailers have been busy during the COVID. It has cost them money, but they've done well out of it.
I want to ask you about online in a moment, but let's talk about the takeovers, because really big money is at stake here. You've talked about getting back to the brand, getting back to retail basics, but what are the risks for this business?
Well, the risks are that it loads the business with a huge amount of debt. It doesn't make the right decisions. It's said at the moment, this offer, which the board has recommended, they have been talking to this company for some time, which it appears now, but it still has to be to the shareholders. And the thing about Morrisons is that it's slightly different from the other three big retailers in the fact that it owns more of its own supply chain, buys direct from the farmers, the whole product, makes a lot of its own produce under its own name. And it owns that value chain, whereas the others deal with suppliers on a regular basis, but they're not in the same way. So there's quite a bit of worry and concern about people that if it gets too much debt, and then it starts to worry suppliers. Also, the other end of the day, we've seen retailers here, big retail chain in headquarters in Oxford Street, Debenhams, was bought by a financial company. They sold off the freeholds, they took the value out of it, saddled it so much debt that now it's disappeared. Well, that's unlikely to happen to Morrison's, but it could put it under pressure at the end of the day, particularly its suppliers. And it's important for the UK because we're a very attractive consumer market. We've got very concentrated consumers. There's online shopping, as we're going to talk about, but also people are very good at shopping at Morrison's. The market has been lost a little bit of share, the big four, we've got some discounters who came in here about 15 years ago, and they've really made an impression on the market over the last sort of 8 to 9 years as they've understood what the consumer wanted here.
Well, Teresa, I feel we're not going to have time to talk about online too much, but just quickly, I mean, we've seen a real flurry in interest in supermarkets on the markets since this news has come out. Why, in general, do you think UK supermarkets have been so undervalued?
Well, they've always been undervalued. They can make a profit and the city puts their shares down. They don't really understand them because over the years, the margins used to be about 7 and they're now down to 3 and 4, which is actually what the continental market always was for years. So that's it. They've been undervalued, but people have recognised the property now. And that's the bit that's become more valuable in the eyes of financial companies.
Teresa Wickham, a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much for your insight.
Russian hackers say they're behind a massive ransomware attack that targeted hundreds of companies, both in the United States and worldwide. The cyber attack, which has affected more than 1 million computer systems, began on Friday. The group is demanding $70 million in bitcoins to restore the company's data.
Australia's Sydney Airport has received a $16.7 billion offer from a consortium of investment companies. If successful, it will be one of the country's biggest ever buyouts. The group is taking a longer-term view on the sector, which has been severely hit by the pandemic.
General Motors has expanded its design studio in China to focus on developing electric cars rather than petrol. It comes as the American company looks to phase out petrol and diesel from 2035 and expand market share in China, the largest electric car market. GM is aiming to sell 1 million electric vehicles in the United States and China by 2025.
And the anger of Chinese netizens has sent a Hong Kong beverage company's shares tumbling. Vitasoy's market price fell as much as 14%, the biggest single-day drop since its listing in 1994. Chinese internet users have called for a boycott of the company's products after one worker there offered condolences to the family of a colleague who stabbed a Hong Kong policeman and then killed himself.
Talks aimed at breaking a standoff over oil output have been called off. OPEC ministers clashed last week with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates at odds over plans to continue curbs. Last year, the OPEC Plus group of countries agreed record output cuts of almost 10 million barrels per day after the pandemic hit.
Well, those cuts have since been relaxed amid concern about rising oil prices and inflationary pressures. But the UAE wants to see more production.
Well, let's talk now to Jim Stenman in Dubai. Jim, what's going on here?
So we've just gotten word in the last hour that the meeting has been postponed with no new date set just yet. Last week's OPEC Plus gathering left the oil cartel divided. This as the UAE rejected a proposed 8-month extension to output curbs, basically flexing its muscles against neighbor and ally Saudi Arabia, with the kingdom's energy minister calling for compromise and rationality. The issue, well, it centers on agreeing on just how much to raise production by from August. Abu Dhabi is asking OPEC Plus members to either change course or essentially risk the unraveling of the alliance, which could dramatically increase the price of crude and affect the global economic recovery.
And what's the background to this dispute?
Well, it all goes back to COVID-19, essentially. So OPEC Plus did agree on record cuts of almost 10 million barrels per day last year in the early stages of the pandemic. Those cuts have almost halved with the reopening of countries and currently stand on about 5.8 million BDP. Now, according to Reuters, the UAE agreed to raise output by about 2 million BDP from August to December, but rejected the idea of extending cuts until the end of 2022. And that's where the issue lies. Abu Dhabi is said to want to increase its own baseline that's used when calculating these cuts. Such move would allow it to boost production, especially after investing billions to increase its own capacity. So what happens next? Well, we'll have to wait and see when OPEC Plus reconvenes. It's possible the group could go ahead with the deal until April 2022 and then explore a UAE baseline raise as part of a possible new agreement. Regardless of what happens next, this dispute speaks to growing divergence between the UAE and Saudi Arabia. The two countries have enjoyed a strong alliance, it must be said, combining its financial and military power in Yemen, a conflict that the UAE has since withdrawn from. Now, last year, the UAE normalized ties with Israel, which Saudi Arabia still has no official diplomatic relationship. All of this at a time when the kingdom is seeking to challenge its neighbor as a regional business and tourism hub.
Jim Stenman in Dubai, thank you very much.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead with European football crowds and tennis fans at Wimbledon. Should we be worried about these potential super spreader events?
Search CGTN Europe wherever you get your podcasts to subscribe to The Agenda podcast. The Agenda with me, Stephen Cole, always gets to the heart of the story. Just subscribe today and listen now.
Covering the world from 4 continents. A new horizon. Teams in Beijing, Washington, D.C., Nairobi, and London. Who connect, interact, and inquire to bring you the stories that matter to all. The Link, only on CGTN. Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities. Reinvent. Find new opportunities. Discover a path forward. CGTN. See the difference.
The world has changed under the pressure of the pandemic. For many of us, life is returning to some kind of normal. As we're adapting to changes in all of our lives, let Global Business Europe be your guide to the new normal. Join us weekdays on CGTN.
To Global Business Europe. And a quick reminder, CGTN is available to watch for free on all of the major digital platforms, on Smart TV, online, in Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and Android TV, YouTube and Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app.
China's President Xi Jinping has been meeting European leaders with COVID high on the agenda. German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron spoke to President Xi via video conference.
Washington says it's considering further action against Belarus over the forced landing of a plane and the arrest of a journalist on board. In a speech to the United Nations Human Rights Council, the US delegate called the incident sickening. The White House announced targeted sanctions against key members of the Belarusian government in May. Well, CGTN's Stuart Smith is in Moscow for us. Stuart, a very strongly worded speech from the United States delegate.
Yes, the United States was also joined by the UK in saying that if the situation doesn't improve, further sanctions could be on the cards for Belarus, calling it sickening and saying such contempt for international norms cannot go unanswered. But the strongest words came from the UN rapporteur herself. Anais Marin said the situation in Belarus is deteriorating, with evidence of massive human rights violations, unprecedented in scope and gravity. There are currently, she says, 530 political prisoners in Belarus as well, and also over the past year 35,000 people have been arbitrarily detained. She says the forced grounding of the plane in May shows authorities' desire to end all forms of dissidence, and that those brave enough, in her words, to take to the streets faced disproportionate cruelty.
And any response from Belarus?
We haven't heard anything from either the Belarusian Ministry of Foreign Affairs or the UN, the Belarusian representatives to the United Nations, but we can infer what they may think based on a report that Belarus's mission to the UN sent out last week on its assessment of Western countries' human rights violations. It had a list of 21 countries that it says in the West are also violating human rights, not also, but violating human rights, saying that the paradoxes and hypocrisy in Western politicians' assessments of Belarus means that the West is being very one-sided in its condemnation and should look at itself before making judgments of others.
Stuart Smith in Moscow, thank you very much.
Well, as we just told you, China's President Xi Jinping has been meeting European leaders with COVID high on the agenda. German Chancellor Angela Merkel and French President Emmanuel Macron spoke to President Xi via video conference. And our correspondent Ryan Thompson is in Frankfurt monitoring things. Ryan, what was discussed?
Hi there, Julia. Yeah, we just got the readout of those calls from Berlin, Paris and Beijing, and it's very clear that these three governments are looking to be on the same page ahead of what will be a very busy diplomatic season to come, notably the G20 summit, the World Congress, and the COP climate conference ahead in Glasgow in the fall. Big issue on the menu for these three countries to start off with was climate change, notably making sure some of the world's biggest economies are able to meet their climate goals by ending fossil fuel burning and being able to open up some of these issues in the economy. For the European partners, they were very concerned about European market issues, notably making sure that China doesn't have a one-way street into Europe, but that there is equal terms for both of them being able to sell and trade goods with the other markets. Notably, if you remember, in December, the two sides, the Europe and China, were able to ink that major investment deal. There were also questions about foreign policy given recent developments, notably an election that just happened in Iran, and also some surprising developments in Myanmar. Now, the German and French versions of the call also included a note about they had serious concerns on the human rights situation that is currently ongoing in China. And that's been a major sticking point for European and China relations over the past few months. We've seen them start to sour to some of the lowest levels in years. Some diplomatic observers have even compared it to 1989 levels. We mentioned that investment deal. There's a huge question over its future after the European Parliament suspended its ratification in May until both sides were able to resolve issues over sanctions. The European Union, as well as the Chinese government, have issued sanctions over some issues between the two sides. So until those can be resolved, there's a lot of question marks that lie ahead, but potentially these are some of the baby steps, the initial footwork into resolving a more cooperative relationship for the months and weeks to come.
Ryan Thompson, thanks very much.
Targets for reducing hunger and greenhouse gas emissions from farming will be missed without serious action from the world's leading economies.
That's the verdict of a new joint report from the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development and the UN's Food and Agriculture Organisation. Ross Cullen reports from Paris.
The news is not so good. That was the warning from the Director General of the Food and Agriculture Organisation, who led Monday's video publication of the agricultural outlook for 2021 to 2030. Chu Dong-yu said that leading nations must become more efficient, more green and more forward-thinking to deal with the UN's goals of eradicating global hunger, ensuring food security and promoting healthy diets while safeguarding the future of the planet. He also said that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated the situation.
Its findings clearly show that we need a deep transformation of agri-food systems in order to realize the 2030 agenda and achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Already before the COVID-19 outbreak, as many as 690 million people, or nearly 9% of the world population, were chronically hungry. The pandemic has made the situation worse.
With less than 10 years until the 2030 deadline for achieving the UN's Sustainable Development Goals, governments need to step up their efforts to meet food and environmental targets, said the report authors. The publication is an assessment of the 10-year prospectus for agricultural, commodity, fish and biofuel markets. It gives baseline projections for production, consumption, stocks, trade and prices for commodities such as cereals, sugar, meat, dairy, fish and cotton. There was a note to the shift to more ethical and more environmentally friendly diets, and the report's authors said that while there is increasing meat consumption in emerging economies, there is a trend towards a fall in eating animal proteins in high-income countries. There will be a 4% increase in greenhouse gas emissions coming from the agricultural sector over the next 9 years, with livestock responsible for 80% of those emissions. To end, the OECD and the FAO pointed out that their report was not a forecast on the future state of the agriculture sector and food supply, but rather a plausible scenario based on productivity trends, international market conditions and weather patterns. Ross Cullen, CGTN, Paris.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the Miami building collapse death toll rises to 27 as 3 more bodies are recovered after the apartment block is demolished.
The EU's digital COVID certificate, which offers the promise of unlocking hassle-free travel around Europe this summer.
In less than 2 weeks' time, the Czech border will also open to all EU and Serbian citizens. 4.4 million Hungarians received their first dose of COVID vaccine.
18 and over can receive a COVID-19 vaccination, but it does come with conditions.
Third wave will probably take longer to emerge. This vaccination centre is part of a massive effort to try and drive down the numbers of the new variant that was first identified in India.
On the agenda with me, Stephen Cole, we look up into space. We look down into data. We look at debt. We look at politics. We look at opioids, climate change. We look at all the issues that really matter around the world. But you matter too. We want to tell the stories you want to see and hear about. Make it your agenda.
We can try out the wild and crazy ideas.
Nothing can stop an idea whose time has come, and this idea is coming.
I actually feel quite comfortable in isolation.
We should all be very basic when we try to save the world.
Awesome!
We hope it will happen. We have to live it out.
The agreement is signed.
But what is the real deal now the UK has left the EU? For trade, for business, for the city, for ordinary people. Make sense of Brexit with CGTN. Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe with Jamie Owen and Juliet Mann. Our top stories: tech stocks tumble as China's internet watchdog widens its crackdown on digital platforms. And shopping for a supermarket, the multi-billion-dollar battle for Morrisons, the British retail chain, in the middle of a bidding war.
The UK Prime Minister has said he expects the majority of remaining COVID restrictions in England to be lifted on the 19th of July as planned, although a final decision will come next week. Some scientists have expressed concern as the Delta variant becomes the dominant strain. But Boris Johnson said it was time for the country to cautiously move forward. Our correspondent Andrew Wilson is in Oxford. Good to see you, Andrew. So what's the plan?
Well, again, Boris Johnson was a little more muted than some might have expected. All this talk of Freedom Day, of course, and this is a government we know that loves to dwell on good news if it's got it. Indeed, it is looking like it's going to get rid of most of the restrictions on the 19th of July, but reserves the right to reconsider that up until the 12th of July, so next week before it confirms that announcement. However, Boris Johnson made it clear that he has a plan for the 19th, and that involves 5 points. One is that they're going to shorten the length of time between vaccines from 12 weeks to 8 to make sure that everyone gets into the adult group, gets their double dose in good time by the beginning of September. And then, of course, the tools of controlling the lockdown are going to change, and that's going to involve people being able to go to pubs and clubs and restaurants without having to use a QR code to sign in, or indeed they'll have access to the bar. They won't have to sit at tables. They'll be able to go to concerts and cinemas. It'll no longer be necessary to for people to work from home under instructions. So that's something that will start to ease off as of 19th of July, probably. And also, COVID certificates won't be required to go in and out of places, with the caveat that if institutions do want people to show they've had a vaccine or do want people to wear a mask, for example, they have the right to ask for it. Test, trace and isolate will modify slightly. Children might join that, and the double vaccinated people might be started to treat differently, also treated differently on terms of travel, coming home. They're looking at allowing double vaxxed people to miss out quarantine when they come back from abroad. And the last point was just they will continue to monitor data, and as they've said before, reserve the right to row back some of these measures if they prove problematic down the line.
You talk about rowing things back. I mean, given the rapid rise in cases of the Delta variant in the UK, I mean, what does that mean for what's been said today?
Delta, we were reminded again by the scientific advisors and the medical advisor Chris Whitty, Delta is a huge issue as far as the UK is concerned, as far as Europe's concerned, and still has that ability in the background to destroy best laid plans. So that is always going to be a problem. The Prime Minister also made it clear, though, that they saw it, the scientific community and the political community saw this as a choice between lifting restrictions now or perhaps in the winter, when flu viruses will also be returning, as well as perhaps an upsurge in respiratory infections in general. So whether to do it now or the winter, it seemed like now would be a better time. And if not now or the winter, then when? So there's certainly an element of risk involved. And interestingly, the senior medical advisor, Chris Whitty, said that he felt also, with concerns and with worries about what Delta variant might do in terms of the numbers, the modelling does show that if the UK opens on the 19th of July and people start to spread the virus more willingly, vaccinated members of the population, that the numbers will, of course, climb. And they've been clear about that in terms of hospitalisations, serious illness and even deaths. But the modelling shows that perhaps they won't go back to the peaks that they've seen before at the worst times. So now is as good a time as any, is the result of this press conference that's still going on today.
Andrew Wilson, thanks very much.
Well, Wimbledon will become the first sporting event in the UK to admit capacity crowds. That's for the tennis quarter-finals, semi-finals and finals. The final decision on easing lockdown in England will be taken next week, and that includes relaxing social distancing at major sporting events. Dr. Chris Smith is a medical virologist at the University of Cambridge. I asked him how concerned we should be about these events ramping up COVID infections.
Well, I think we need to ask, what do we expect to happen? Because then we see what we expect to happen happening. Everyone will know we're actually seeing things playing out the way we anticipate, so we're in control. The answer is that when you get more people getting together, you're going to get more disease transmission. So what we fully anticipate will happen is there will be more cases. But let's also not forget the graphs. If we look at the present situation and we compare it with what was happening in European countries like the UK back in January, when we saw similar case loads and we saw similar acceleration of the caseload, we were also seeing a big uptick in the number of people going to hospital and the number of people who were unfortunately losing their lives. Those graphs could not look more different now. And that's why we're hearing very bullish sentiment coming from number 10 Downing Street, because the number of people going to hospital is very, very low. The number of people who are passing away from coronavirus remains very, very low. And what we think accounts for that very gross disparity is the vaccine. And so we are comfortable that the vaccines we have on board in a very significant proportion of the UK population now are helping to break the chain, not just of transmission, because they're doing that to a certain extent, but they're certainly breaking the link between catching this infection and becoming severely unwell.
Well, a related question then. Do you think it's a wise move to lift restrictions in the UK on the 19th of July?
Well, I think you could turn the question round and say, well, if not the 19th of July, when will be a prudent time to lift restrictions? Because historically, people may have answered that question by saying, well, we'll wait until there's zero COVID. But Patrick Vallance, who's our Chief Scientific Officer, has put it very well when he said there is zero chance of zero COVID, because scientists and doctors internationally agree that this is an endemic infection. In other words, it's not going away. We're going to have to see coronavirus live alongside us for the foreseeable future, certainly years, decades, possibly longer than that, possibly indefinitely. So with a view to having to live alongside this thing, we then have to ask the question, well, how do we live alongside it, control it, and minimise its impact on our lives? And the vaccines almost certainly are helping to do that, because they're translating what would have been casualties into merely cases, and that's where we need to be.
Do you think we should start vaccinating children now?
Well, it depends. And obviously there are several ways of looking at this. And one camp argues that actually we're dealing with a more infectious variant of the virus at the moment, the Delta variant, and a virus that's more infectious dictates that we need to vaccinate a higher proportion of the population to stop it spreading. That's what we call the herd immunity threshold. And given it is more infectious, it's more transmissible, it's causing more cases, that means we need to vaccinate more people, which could include vaccinating younger people.
Around 150 children are missing after an armed gang targeted a school in Nigeria. It's the latest in a string of mass kidnappings in the country. Our correspondent Phil Ihaza is in Abuja for us. Phil, what more do we know about this?
Well, thank you, Juliet. What we know at the moment is that there's quite several efforts by the government engaging security operatives, a mixture of the military, that's the Army, Navy and Air Force, and of course the police and other sister agencies, to try to find and rescue these children unhurt and alive and return back to their parents. But we know that the police command in Kaduna State, that's in northwest Nigeria, have confirmed the incident, but they're yet to verify the number of students kidnapped. At the moment, they say 26 have been rescued by the operatives, and they're currently undergoing medical checkups before they're reunited with their parents and other relatives. We also know that quite a number of parents and guardians are currently agitating on a major road. It's a Kaduna-Kachia road, and they're protesting for putting pressure on the government to do more to find these children and also find the perpetrators and bring them to book. It's quite an emotional experience, an unfortunate one as well at the moment in Kaduna State.
You mentioned that there's pressure from parents to get the government to do more. I mean, there have been several school abductions in different parts of Nigeria this year. So why is this happening? And what is the government trying to do about it?
Well, it's a rather very technical question, because if you look at it from the part of the government, from the presidency to the state governors, they're all saying and pledging that they're doing all they can to stop and forestall further kidnappings and attacks, especially in schools. But if you look at comments from critics and other security experts, they're saying that the government is not doing enough with regards to beefing up security presence in many of these schools, especially in remote areas, outskirts of several states, especially in the northern part of the country. If you look at the nature of this attack, it's a semblance of several others that have occurred in the earlier weeks or months in the year. The kidnappers made their way through the fence, and they had a better vantage point inside the school to engage security operatives who tried to come at a rescue call to get the students, and they made their way into the forest. So what people are saying, security experts are saying, is that the government will need to initiate community policing, vigilante efforts, more involvement of the locals in ensuring that these schools are protected, and also beef up security presence in many of these remote areas, and also find some of these criminals and bring them to book, use them as a scapegoat to kind of deter others from engaging in such heinous acts. But this is the current situation. We're monitoring to get more updates from the government about the rescue operation ongoing in Kaduna State.
We hope they find those children. Well, Phil Ihasa, thank you very much for the update.
Rescue crews have resumed their search for survivors of the apartment block in Miami. They were given the go-ahead after the remaining building was demolished over safety concerns. Explosives brought the structure down, which was deemed dangerous ahead of the arrival of Tropical Storm Elsa. 27 bodies have now been recovered since the tragedy 2 weeks ago. 118 people are still missing.
Honestly, this precise moment, I feel relief. I feel relief because this building was unstable. The building was hampering our search efforts. Really, we were stuck, that we couldn't get to a certain part of the pile. I've heard them say that they think there are voids in this area, areas where they'll be able to search. So I'm excited.
Well, our correspondent Nitza Soledad Perez is in Miami for us. Nitza, a clear sense of urgency in demolishing the remaining building.
Indeed, the tower wasn't safe. It was shifting. Sensors underground registered 15 to 30 centimeters movements within the structure, and the fear was that it could collapse while rescue teams were on the ground. Now, Tropical Storm Elsa has added more urgency to this decision. Authorities, that's why they just decided to pull the trigger and went ahead with it last night. Now, the goal was to keep this new debris from falling on top of the existing pile of rubble, and it went according to plan. It did not. So now rescue teams are back on the ground. They resumed operations just an hour after the implosion. The teams are focusing now in areas that they could not access before, where they believe there could be any voids, and find any possible victims or people. As you said, 3 more victims were found overnight after the implosion, bringing the official death toll to 27. More than 115 people are still missing.
Well, the big question, the big hope, is there any prospect of finding more survivors?
And I am sad to say that it's just about hope at this point. The probability is extremely low, and this was even confirmed by the Israeli rescue teams that are assisting the Miami teams here in the city. It's been 12 days, and no one has been pulled out from that rubble alive since the first hours after the collapse. It was just that teenage boy, that 15-year-old boy, that was rescued a few hours after, but nobody else. Also, with more rain and winds associated with Tropical Storm Elsa, we could see another pause in this search and rescue mission. The agony of these families continue, and the fact is that they might never get any certainty of what truly happened to their loved ones.
Nitza Soledad Perez in Miami, thank you very much. The Afghan government says its warplanes have killed dozens of Taliban fighters in separate airstrikes. At least 20 militants were killed in the western Farah province, including a key Taliban commander, while 15 fighters died in strikes around the city of Kunduz, according to an army spokesperson.
Rescue workers are continuing to search through mud and debris following Saturday's huge landslide at a Japanese seaside town. 80 people are still missing in Atami. Officials say they're preparing to release the names of those unaccounted for in the hope that some may have been away from the area at the time.
Firefighters in Cyprus say they've managed to control the island's worst wildfires after 2 days of intense operations. The fires ripped through mountain forests and farmland, killing 4 people and destroying scores of homes. Planes from Greece, Israel and the UK helped to douse the flames, which have scorched around 55 square kilometres of the Troodos mountain range.
Luxembourg's Prime Minister is in hospital after testing positive for COVID-19. Xavier Bettel is said to be undergoing additional tests and will remain under observation for at least 24 hours. Bettel took part in a 2-day EU summit in Brussels in June with several European leaders.
Israel Health Ministry data suggests the efficacy of the Pfizer vaccine in preventing COVID infections has declined by nearly a third, largely due to the spread of the Delta variant. The latest figures show an efficacy rate of 64% from June until July, down from 94% a month earlier. The data also show the jab is still protecting against severe illness.
Despite growing vaccination rates in the United States, a gap has emerged between Black and Latino Americans and other ethnic groups. It is Tian Shan reports from Los Angeles.
There are major disparities among certain racial groups in the race to vaccinate as many people as possible in the U.S. against COVID-19. It's especially evident here in Los Angeles. According to the LA County Health Department, those who received at least one shot across the county include 63% of the white residents, 59% Native Americans, and 71% Asian Americans. Only 41% of Black residents and 48% of Latinos have been at least partially vaccinated so far, and the gap is even larger among the youngest age groups. This has also resulted in increased chances of infection and death. The county's health department suggests Black residents are now about twice as likely and Latinos about 60% more likely to be hospitalized with coronavirus than white residents in LA County. They've also roughly twice the risk of dying. Take a listen to what the county's public health director had to say.
We are still seeing significant inequities that translate to greater rates of death among people of color, as I noted earlier. This slide also shows that deaths among people of color are seeing a less of a decline than deaths among people who are white.
She said these inequities reflect the historical lack of medical resources in underserved communities. Some of the lowest income neighborhoods have fewer vaccination sites and people have to go longer distances. Many lower income residents may be working multiple jobs and worry about having to take a day off to get the vaccine. Outreach among some communities has also been limited, with officials still struggling to convince residents the vaccine is free and safe. Many Hispanic residents are worried about registering for the vaccine, falsely thinking that it could negatively impact their immigration status. All these reasons have contributed to lower vaccination rates among Latinos and people of color who've already borne the brunt of this pandemic. It is Tian Shan, CGTN, Los Angeles.
You're watching CGTN. Still ahead, the man who makes more money every second than the average US worker in a week. Jeff Bezos steps down as boss of Amazon.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there. To see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you. All around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London. China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.
Mari, what would you say is a good question?
Stephen, I'd say it's one where there's always more than one answer.
The Answers Project is a new podcast series from CGTN Europe. With me, Stephen Cole.
And me, Mari Beveridge. In each episode, we'll take a complex question.
And with the help of some of the world's foremost experts, shine light on some of the answers. So join us for The Answers Project.
Available wherever you get your podcasts.
Hello, welcome back to Global Business Europe. He's turned the world upside down. That's what some say about Amazon founder Jeff Bezos, who's stepping down as CEO after 27 years.
He started the business in 1994 from his garage in Washington. Today, it's a $1 trillion company. James Bevan is a business analyst at CCLA Investment Management, and I asked him for his take on the Bezos years.
Mr. Bezos has had the most extraordinary impact. If we were to go back to 1994, few people believe that he would genuinely be able to take on the conventional store sellers. He has turned the world upside down, introducing e-commerce, driving online, and demonstrating that not only can you order online, but you can get very quick delivery. Indeed, in the States, he is now moving to have same-day delivery in urban centres.
Now, many say the backbone to his and to the business's success was his particular management style. Was it?
Well, he has absolutely acquired a coterie of very capable people around him. Indeed, Andy Jassy, who takes over as chief executive today, was one of the early providers of talent to Amazon, joining in 1997 after the company first floated in 1994. And I would suspect that Amazon's style, which in many ways is regarded as abrasive and difficult, rather masculine and white, has been one of the factors that Mr. Bezos would mark down as a success.
You said it there, business visionary or ruthless profiteer. I mean, Bezos does have his critics, doesn't he?
Oh, he does. He is one of these Marmite people you either love or loathe. But it is clear that he has made a hugely successful company. He employs well over 1 million people globally. He has raised standards of living for people who otherwise would have difficulty getting access to books and materials. And on that basis alone, you have to congratulate him.
Now, we know that tech innovation is his lifeblood. He's booked to go into space. But other than that, what else might his future hold? Are we looking at Bezos for president?
Well, I'm absolutely looking at Bezos, the philanthropist. He's made it abundantly clear that a reasonably large chunk of his personal wealth is going to go to supporting charitable causes.
Now, you mentioned his successor, Andy Jassy. Big shoes to fill. What do you expect him to achieve in the short term?
Well, interestingly, Andy Jassy has worked with Jeff Bezos since he joined the company in 1997. So I think that we're going to see more of the same. If you were to ask me to compare and contrast two characters, I would say that Mr. Jassy is less visionary, but he has a greater eye for detail. So he's a guy who absolutely gets involved in really understanding what's going on. He challenges the creative people to come up with ideas that will break the mold. And I think that this characteristic of Mr. Jassy is going to be oh so important coming into this critical period for Amazon, because it faces a very significant set of challenges from state and governmental regulators who say that Amazon's become too big, Amazon has too much power, and Mr. Jassy will challenge back and challenge hard.
Campaigners on England's east coast are calling for better sea defences in the village of Hemsby. The picturesque seafront is eroding faster than ever.
It's being caused by more extreme weather and rising tides. Kitty Logan reports.
With its sandy beach stretching into the distance, Hemsby is a popular seaside destination. But the sea is sweeping in ever closer to this village, threatening homes overlooking it.
Every high tide, the water is hitting the dunes and taking more and more sand away. We have no proper sea defence in front of the village. If nothing is done, then the village will be heavily damaged. It will damage trade, it will damage people's homes and livelihoods.
In 2018, an entire row of houses was lost as the coast crumbled in a storm. The land they once stood on, gone forever. Only one resident defiantly clings on, surrounded by memories and remains of neighbours' homes. This is life on the edge, literally. An estimated 90 homes still at risk of falling from the cliffs. The distance to the sea shrinking fast. The speed of these changes is detrimental for residents and the tourist trade they thrive on.
Investment in the area is reduced because people don't want to put their money into something that's likely to wash away, or somewhere where people are no longer going to come because it's no longer an attractive beach.
Some erosion is natural and unavoidable. Norfolk's soft sand and clay coastline erodes easily. In January, heavy rain triggered a fresh collapse nearby, and as sea levels slowly rise, the coast feels the full force of northerly storms.
Coastal erosion is a problem in many parts of the UK, but this section of Norfolk coastline is especially exposed and vulnerable. Much more damage to the shoreline is predicted here in the coming years.
Scientists say climate change is a major factor, with more extreme weather now and sea levels set to rise by around 1 metre this century.
And if the sea level is higher, that means you get higher storm surges, or you get more waves that can reach further up the beaches and cliffs, essentially, so you get much more erosion.
The government says it's investing more funds to protect the coast in the coming years. Campaigners here want a solid sea barrier built now to buy them more time. But even that won't save everything.
It's inevitable some homes will be lost in the next 20 years. How many is the thing we're talking about? So we need to try and minimise that as much as possible. And what we need really is that fast action. We need something to happen soon.
Slowing climate change could help prevent some coastal erosion, but is it too late to turn the tide?
We're already locked into some degree of sea level rise, even if we stopped emitting tomorrow. But the more we do to prevent our emissions increasing very steeply, the better the final outcome will be.
This June is the last line of defence for Hemsby. It too will eventually fall. And then the heart of this seaside community could be gone. Kitty Logan, CGTN, Norfolk.
The headlines again. Tech stocks tumble as China's internet watchdog widens its crackdown on big digital companies.
Shopping for a supermarket. The multi-billion-dollar battle for Morrisons. The British retail chain in the middle of a bidding war.
And the UK Prime Minister has said he expects the majority of remaining COVID restrictions in England to be lifted on the 19th of July, although a final decision will be made next week. Some scientists have expressed concern as the Delta variant becomes the dominant UK strain. But Boris Johnson said it was time for the country to cautiously move forward.
We must be honest with ourselves that if we can't reopen our society in the next few weeks, when we will be helped by the arrival of summer and by the school holidays, then we must ask ourselves, when will we be able to return to normal?
Well, that's it for Global Business Europe. Thanks for watching.
More on all of our stories at europe.cgtn.com, and do follow CGTN Europe on Twitter, Facebook and Instagram.
We're on smart TV apps such as Roku, Apple TV, Amazon Fire and on Android TV. We're on YouTube, Dailymotion, CGTN.com and the CGTN app.
We'll see you again tomorrow, same time, same place. From all of the team in London, it's goodbye.